Coming to you live from beautiful San Luis Obispo. This is DGAF News with your evening update. I'm Devin.
And I'm Ryan.
And let's see what we have for you folks tonight. Ryan, take it away.
So tonight we have a very interesting story about some cutting-edge research coming to us from Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo right here in town. I believe it's more specifically from that EE department, which we know ranks real high every year. And more specifically, we've got a couple of topologies to go over, and more specifically, the region in which they operate, which I believe is called the subthreshold region.
The subthreshold, I keep hearing that word. It's a good one. What does that mean, right?
So what I got here from my limited research and knowledge is it's the region at which most people would say that there's no current, or the cutoff region.
No current. Okay.
Apparently, that's false.
Okay, false.
What is actually happening? There is a small amount of current, and it's actually happening. When VGS is less than your VT, which I
believe that is the threshold voltage, as they call it.
That is VT, I believe.
That is VT. Okay, well that must mean that if it's less than VT, it's got to have a lot less current, right?
Tiny amounts of current.
Oh,
but
really?
You know what comes with that?
What?
Tiny power.
Ooh, tiny power dissipation. You love to hear
Minuscule.
that. No, what about the gain? What are we working with?
So, back to those two topologies I was talking about.
Yes, of course.
I'm going to start us off with the bulk-driven topology.
The bulk-driven, is that the one? Okay.
So, in most cases, this is the fourth terminal actually in a MOSFET that you don't really worry about. You normally diode connect that. PMOS, you throw it up there to the VDD normally, and you throw the NMOS down there to the ground.
Down to ground, okay.
So in the bulk driven, we're not biasing that. We're gonna throw the input signal right on it.
Right on top of the bulk.
And for this subthreshold ultra low power specific applications, this is perfect because you can tie the whole thing to subthreshold and still drive a rail-to-rail input.
Interesting.
Big positive.
What about the transconductance parameters?
It's tiny. It's a lot less than the gate transconductance.
Does that mean less gain compared to original?
That definitely means less gain, less current.
Okay, but less current. That is the key here, is it not, folks? Less current.
Rail-to-rail.
Rail-to-rail output. And the second topology you have, what's that called, Ryan?
I believe that's called the gate-driven, which is most of what we're familiar to here.
Okay, that is the gate-driven. Let's see what we got on that. It is higher gain than the bulk-driven, apparently.
I would concur with that.
I would believe that it has an limit on V in, correct?
Yeah, what is that limit? I believe it's something to do with that VT value we're talking about earlier.
Yeah, the threshold voltage. It must be less than threshold, because if you go outside of there, you might operate in one of those forbidden strong inversion regions. Now, we don't want that because why, Ryan?
That'd be high power.
High power. Now, let's do some analysis at our desk upstairs.
Thank you to the boys downstairs for the excellent news. Let's get into the analysis of these low power subthreshold op amps. Let's start with the gate-driven op amp. So let's see, we've got a CMOS op amp here. Right here we have our V out, V in. This is grounded, so that would make this a common source. The PMOS has a biasing voltage suitable enough to keep it always on. We've connected the base to the most positive voltage and the base of the NMOS to the most negative voltage, or ground. Now, let's see what we get when we sweep our V in. Here we have the VGS versus ID curve. Now, on the left we have our weak inversion region, and on the right our strong inversion region. Now, we're going to be looking at the weak inversion region when VGS is less than the threshold voltage of 355 millivolts, because that's where the good things happen. You can see on our right we have microamps of current showing how we are operating with very low power. Let's get on to the family of curves analyzing VGS. So here we have our VGS sweep. We have a VDS sweep as well. We're going to be stepping VGS though, so that we can get a family of curves. The rest of the circuit setup is the same. VDD of 1 volt, V bias of half a volt, connected to sub C, and this connected to the rail. Let's look at the curves. So here we have our familiar looking curves. The topmost curve shows VGS is equal to VT plus 50 millivolts. So it's greater than VT. That means we are leaving the weak inversion region, approaching the strong inversion region. Moving on, we have our VGS equal to VT, and you can see the jump in current is pretty substantial. We've got about almost 2 mics here and about 4 up here. So that's a substantial jump. And below this, we have our VGS of less than VT. So you can see that this looks familiar, but we are mostly interested in these sub-threshold ones. Now I'm going to pass this on to Ryan to compare it with our base-driven.
Thanks for that recap, Dr. Ferguson, on the gate-driven topology. Moving on to the bulk-driven topology. As you can see here, the input voltage is now driven directly to the bulk, and the gate to source is biased as to be 0, so that it is always in the weak conversion area of operation. So to keep it the same, we kept the same common source amplifier, and we kept the same PMOS active load. So all the results are very one-to-one, easy to relate. So moving on to the first characteristic curve here, we have Vin, which is VBS versus ID. And to compare this directly to the gate to source or gate driven topology, that is limited by VT. So the input voltage or the gate to source voltage cannot be greater than VT, otherwise it will be out of the weak inversion and into the strong inversion area of operation. However, with the bulk driven topology, we're able to have a full swing on the input, which gives us higher current, and that is a huge upside to the bulk driven topology. Now, as you said earlier, the main downside to this topology is still the fact that the transconductance of the bulk is a lot less than that of the gate. But moving on to the next family, or next characteristic curve, is the family of curves of VDS versus ID. Now, as I said before, these are still all in the weak inversion area, and as you can see, VBS moves down as it steps down. We still have high current gain, but right here is the main one that we're looking at, where VBS minus VT they're about the same, which is one of the key differences between the bulk driven topology and the gate driven topology. So as we move forward, looking at the multi-stage amplifiers, we can kind of be using these results as building blocks of understanding.
Well, thank you to the boys upstairs for the great analysis, Ryan. Let's get back into our discussion on these sub-threshold op amps. What do you got for me?
So we're going to, looking back at those two topologies we were talking about earlier, and kind of combining that with what we just learned from the boys upstairs.
Okay.
And we're going to end up with a multi-stage amplifier that follows those same characteristics that we just learned from upstairs.
Interesting.
So within this multi-stage, we're going to start with a differential bulk-driven pair.
Bulk-driven, okay.
So this is going to be the bulk-driven versus the gate.
Gate-driven.
So starting with the bulk. Anyway, continuing on. So we're going to take that, since those are relatively low voltages due to the base low transconductance values. We're going to get real low voltages, which we are then going to level shift up in the next stage. So the level shifting stage is the second stage.
Second stage.
And so we're going to take that and bring it back up to a reasonable level that will give us a solid output signal.
Okay.
And mind you, these rails are 0.6 in this case.
Okay.
So 600 millivolts.
Very low. And what about the current flowing through?
Current's pretty tiny because we got a power dissipation or consumption of about 550 nanowatts.
550 nanowatts. Wow.
Yeah, we're sitting right about a half microwatt.
That is nice.
So as you can imagine, that current's pretty small.
Okay.
And we're on the scale of microamps.
Yeah, I like that. Now, what kind of gain are we talking?
So we're talking about a relatively small gain due to that small transconductance value.
Okay.
And with no gain stage in this amplifier, due to the relatively low gain, we're pretty limited there. So it's about anywhere between 1 unity and the research shows here that they got it up to about 1.6.
Okay, well, I believe the boys upstairs, they're good with their research. Now, let's compare that to the gate-driven.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Well, let's see. The gate-driven multi-stage operational amplifier is similar to the bulk-driven, I believe. Very similar input stages, correct? We both got differential input stages on both of them. This one also has a current mirror for biasing, but I believe the bias is a lot lower. I think we're dealing with 10 nanoamps.
Yeah, we're dealing with about 130 in the.
Okay, so about magnitude of order less. So that must mean a lot less power dissipation, correct?
Yeah, what kind of numbers are you running on that?
Let's see. We've got 50 nanowatts of power dissipation when in normal operation.
So to recap, that's a 500 to 50 ratio here.
That is, yes, that is, I like that.
100 to 1 ratio.
Yeah, crazy stuff. Now, I believe that the other stages of the gate-driven op-amp include a biasing stage for the output. I believe to keep that in the right region, we want to keep it all in sub-threshold. Keep those low currents flowing. And then after that, we have a compensation stage. That'll improve the frequency response, I believe. And then after that, we have a class AB output stage. And we're going with the AB output stage to improve slew rate. We don't want such a slow transition. And as well as improving the transconductance parameter. That'll mean lower power. Now, with that low power consumption, I believe it still has a good gain, better than the bulk driven, I would say.
I would believe so, based on this research we got.
I think let's see the numbers we were running, getting about 5 volts per volt. Well, I should say millivolts per volt, but I think that's where we're at. Now, now let's see what the guys upstairs have to add on to that.
Yeah, we'll see what kind of results they're really pulling down from this test.
Thank you, guys. So we cooked up a little circuit like the one you were describing. And let's run through it. First up, we have the gate-driven op-amp. Here's our differential input stage. We've got our differential inputs actively loaded by these two PMOS and biased by this transistor down here. The next stage is the output biasing stage, right? So this PMOS right here biases this PMOS to operate in the correct region that we want it to, namely the sub-threshold region, to keep those currents low. Next, we have the compensation stage. This is mostly to improve the frequency response. And then lastly, our class AB output stage. So let's run some tests and see what we get. Here we have our 1 millivolt input voltage, and this will go with on the negative input terminal. Now, the output voltage takes a little time to get up to its maximum values, but when it does, it gives us about a 5 millivolt output, giving us a gain of 5. Now, the total currents running through all the branches add up to about 45 nano. Now, with such a low current flowing through it, that gives us about a 45 nanowatt power consumption with a gain of 5 volts. Now, let's compare that to the bulk-driven topology.
All right, getting back into the bulk-driven operational amplifier, we're going to start off here with really what makes it a bulk-driven amplifier, and that is this differential pair, which is bulk-driven. So for the means of this experiment, we ground the negative terminal and we drive the input on the positive, so as to not run it as common mode, running it as differential mode. So moving forward, that's the first stage. The second stage here is the level shifting stage, which, as we talked about earlier, brings it back up to a higher voltage, so when you output your signal, it's not corrupted and hitting low on the low rail. And then moving into the output stage, it's just your typical output stage, nothing fancy. So looking at the results here, you can see this green curve here is VN, which is a 300 millivolt peak-to-peak waveform, and right here you have the red waveform, which is your VO. So the calculated gain was around 1.6, which we were talking about earlier, so it holds true. And then after layout, we got within 10% of the total power consumption of what we originally calculated. And that is all we have for you tonight.